Shemina, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'd love to ask you a few questions about your writing and your poetry. And the first question for you, a few years ago you said in an interview with the Forward Arts Foundation, if my first collection was about understanding one's place in the world, then the second collection is about understanding what it is to be committed and devoted, the tiredness and the bliss of it. How did the most recent book, your third UK published collection, The Island of the Sound, take shape?
So yeah, the second book was very much about being a stay-at-home father, looking after my son when he was just newborn. And part of that experience, and I think it's reflected in the collection, was the world was very small. Having the first collection, Moontide, here, it was a first collection, debut collection. It was about the island, so it felt like it had a lot of horizon. But Nocturne felt closed in and maybe the size of about one room, really. And so, I think it was probably the experience of a lot of parents where eventually the child gets old enough and you begin to get your mind back again, you begin to read again. And so this book just, I think, is that sort of expanding of again being able to look out what interests you, what books are you reading, and what kind of artistic things are inspiring again. So a big part of that was just reflecting on just again my own place, finding my own place as a writer and as a person after such an intense period. So my son is now 10, and it just feels like just a different place in terms of where I am, and I hope that's reflected in the poems. The first poem here is called Apprenticeship. What I was thinking when writing this poem was about how the first job you do, the first work, in the way that a first love might impact you for the rest of your life, the first job that you do and how it might impact all other parts of your working life. So when it came to poetry, the first job I actually did was as a crab sorter on the Outer Hebrides. I grew up in a fishing village of Ludag, and I wanted to have a think about how this might have impacted the poetry I would later go on to read and write. Apprenticeship. Dusk on the water. The job was to watch, unracked, the wet, still dripping creels being tipped into the grading tray, alive with life. Our seas provided black-eyed velvet crabs, with small horns ridging their top plates. The work to grade by size. Those big as a fist, they pointed, big as a heart I saw, were lifted out as worth a better price. Ours you would weigh by hand and eye and a slow part of the mind. Young jeweller at a tray of breathing stones. Arbiter at the filling, refilling box. The night progressing until the shed light drew out thick moths. To work was to find yourself drawn in, or was it drawn back to something careful and mysterious, hard-shelled and resistant, big as a fist or heart. The same rain falls on that shed and on this house. I did it 5 years, and then I did it the rest of my life.
Have you always wanted to be a poet?
Well, to be honest, I didn't really even know what a poet was for most part. As I have referenced in a few interviews, I grew up on Ludag, so it's a fishing village, on the island of South US, one of the Outer Hebrides, and I don't want to do too much down on my upbringing, because it was pretty positive and pretty great in many regards, but the idea of sitting and reading or sitting and thinking, you're always scolded for stop doing nothing, and that was my nothing that I often did. And so this sense of being a poet or a writer, it didn't factor at all. I knew no poets, I knew no writers, so it was a slow coming to it. I actually went to university to study history. That was a serious subject, in my opinion. But in Scottish education, you've got to fill your columns, you've got to do certain subjects, and just by luck, by chance, I went to to do English literature as well, and then I did it joint with history, and then I ended up just taking it solely as a university subject, just because I felt so drawn in and it spoke to me. So then when you're reading a lot of people, you end up wanting to join the conversation, and that's what I've been trying to do the whole time since. This poem here is maybe a follow-on from Nocturne, my second collection. Nocturne dealt with being a young stay-at-home father, and in those kind of hours, everything's a poem. You know, when you're first holding your child, first illness, as one of the poems is, all these things just immediately seem like poems. And then as your child grows older, life just becomes more regular, and every now and again, though, the poem will sneak up on you. And this poem kind of snuck up during when I was teaching him how to ride his bike on a Sunday morning. So it's called Morning Lessons. Cold Sunday in school's tarred playground. The flat course round, the shuttered classrooms and mute bells. I was out of breath, running and running, balancing what he couldn't balance yet. The speeding, moving bicycle, its blood-like frame. Keep going, I kept saying, as his legs whirled their small, aired nothings. Everything then seemed a short road towards new manhood, adulthood, weaving directionless, but here and there he started to guide straight. Time's rain fell on me when he steadied and pushed off as if from my hands. I was still running forwards, even when I shouted to be left behind.
The idea of song and musicality and language breathe effervescently through your poetry. What makes you so passionate about lifting the speech away from the mundane everything and make it sing? As I think you said, this is quoted from, I think you did a stanza workshop a couple of years ago, and I came across that while sort of looking up your previous interviews.
So, to be honest, I think it's just the rare opportunity to do something different with speech. I mean, every genre has a thing that it's good at. Fiction has its own. This is an Auden, an idea of Auden's from the Dyer's Hand, where he says, if there's two genres doing the same thing, then one will cease to exist. So the point for me of poetry is to do things differently with language. Again, part of my upbringing on Uist, I relate to in one of the poems in the book, is I went to a Gaelic mass every Sunday, so that was part of my upbringing, but I didn't know Gaelic. So what are you doing then in that situation other than sitting in the sound of language? You're not sitting there with the meaning of language, you're sitting there with the music and the rhythms and the call and the response. And so when I think about writing, it's not necessarily it's the language lifted into just a touch more music. That's what I'm interested in. Just how can you shift it enough that it feels real and feels honest, like somebody is actually speaking, but that it's also itself and it is identifiable as something a little bit changed. So yeah, those are my preoccupations, I would say, a bit when it comes to the language and the music. There's a debt in my poems to a lot of Irish writers. This poem called The Windows begins with a acknowledgement to the Heaney poem with a particular line, it was all hutch and hatch. As most people, I think I've rented for most of my life and lived in quite ramshackle houses. And so eventually when we moved into our own house, one that we were able to get a mortgage for, we bought new windows to replace the kind of rotted old ones. Now, old windows, when you're looking through them, there's just that touch of warp in the glass from the years, and so it was just such a strange experience to look at something so new and so clear. So the windows. When those new windows, sashed and cased, were hoisted in, later than most, I understood the phrase as clear as glass. Out went those wrinkled, ancient fingerprints of pains, fogged, misted, smudged by time, or else holding a little breath of a ripple through their ice. All these years, I didn't know I wasn't seeing clearly. But now, if asked to make my stand, I'd say that love comes with seeing things just as they are. Clear, detailed laburnum in September's garden, crisply swaying. First among the miracles was the laying hands on the blind.
How had your Hebridean heritage and the experience of island dwelling shaped your poetic language? If at all, of course.
I mean, I was telling other people this recently when I was doing a reading, but so there's another famous Scottish island poet. I mean, there's George Mackay Brown, obviously, on Orkney, but another Orcadian poet called Edwin Muir. Edwin Muir, he ended up moving to Glasgow when he was young. He wrote about this. Now, he said the distance between Orkney and Glasgow is about 150 years. You know, and that's the point. Like, he went from one understanding of how you live and how you act and how you, yes, just engage in a community, to then uproar in the city. So, I mean, how does growing up in the islands affect me? It certainly has left an impact. I don't know if it's necessarily an artistic one only. I mean, it's just about my worldview, perhaps. I was living in Leeds, I was living in cities for a long, long time, and now I'm back on a village in Fife by the water, and it just feels natural. You know, I was saying to my wife, that's it, I don't think we move again. So there's, to be honest, how does it impact me? Probably too many ways to count, too many ways to tell, I would say.
I think part of that resonates with me, not as an island dweller, but in North Wales and South Wales, there's a great transport divide. That, you know, it's actually easy for me living in Cardiff to come down to London. It would take me 2 hours on the train or 3 hours on the coach, but it would take me 5 hours to get to somewhere like Bangor in North Wales. And so I can, when I listen to the poetry of the North Wales poet, I can see that we write about landscapes differently. You know, our world is quite different. So I can, that's, you know, the idea of the 150 years between Glasgow and sort of the place you mentioned. It just feels like, you know, something that only, I guess, a country where the transport network is, in a way, kind of not so integrated.
I mean, part of growing up in youth was just as well, it took a long time to get anywhere. You know, if you wanted to go to the nearest shop, it was about 20 minutes to 30 minutes in a car. If you wanted to go to your primary school or even your secondary school, so every day through childhood, it took an hour.
Yes.
You know, so everything was waiting, and everything for me was daydreaming. You know, I'm never more comfortable than when I'm at a window, be it on a plane or a train or a car, and that's part of it. You just, everything slows down, and you know, that's again a big part of it. Language slowed down, thought slowed down. People often say this about maybe my poetry, that I tend to slow things down, and I suppose that's just because just thought just happens to go that way. As soon as I go to a poem, it's like being at a window, you know, the blank page, a little window of its own, and you just start thinking and going deeper into things, and just everything kind of trims down a little bit.
Can you please elaborate on the story behind the poem The Death of the Birds from your latest Ballads collection?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose as I point to in the reading of it, it's just a number of factors coming in from the experience of finding this bird and it having quite a visceral impact. You know, just this sense of something beautiful curled up and delicate and still, and the little trail coming from his beak. It didn't leave an impact in a way that, I mean, I was working as a night manager and of a hotel. Part of the jobs that I do just to sometimes make ends meet in poetry. And so in this job you saw all sorts of terrible things. seriously, there was lots of violence, there was drug use and alcohol. But the thing that stopped me in my tracks was this bird lying dead on the ground by the grass, or by the glass of the windows. And I was just again reflecting on how my impact might be replicated by other people. If it wasn't one, it wasn't 100 or 1,000, it was all of the birds stopping. Because in small ways and big ways, they play a part. I mean, probably around here there's seagulls, certainly on US there'll be seagulls and there's pigeons. They would leave such a curious quietness, and I think that quietness would probably kill us, you know? That's my idea behind it. The next poem here is called The Death of the Birds. I was thinking particularly, I mean, at the time in the news there was about a plague or disease in the bird colonies, and a lot were washing up on land. But I was also working, and part of my job in this particular employment was to walk around the grounds and just look for anything out of the ordinary. And one morning, early, about 6 a.m., I came across a bird that had died. I think it must have hit against the glass and then fallen, and it lay absolutely pristine with just the smallest streak coming from its beak. And I was just wondering then whether what thing would shake people from the kind of stupor of leaving things as they are, and whether something as grand and as kind of terrible as all the birds dying would not have such an impact. The death of the birds. Tonight, the blue book of the universe falls open on the page, the death of the birds, holding descriptions of grass chaliced, mud-set nestings gone cold, of dwindling V's heading northwards. There are captions about the rot in the colony when the whole flock washed in like the worst tide. They'll say, it came unannounced. Already plain speckled eggs were imagined Eucharistic in the twig's brown bowl. The loss circled. Silence above all silence called out over the evening fields.
Who are your poetry and writing inspirations from the past and present?
Who are my inspirations? I was always fond. I never saw any big divide between when I was reading Renaissance writers or Restoration playwrights. I was always really moved by them. I particularly liked the Romantic poets, especially in university times. But in terms of who had the most impact on my kind of actual writing and not just enjoyment, I mean, I've obviously got very large debts to Heaney and Longley, the Irish writers of last century, and obviously this century too. But it feels particularly Celtic. Scottish writers too, be it Mackay Brown, Norm MacCaig, not so much Hugh MacDiarmid, but even contemporary Scottish poets. I'm happily traditionalist on that front. I think the one thing, or the thing that we do particularly well in Scotland is the lyric poem, the lyric poetry that we write. And I just love this idea of stepping into this tradition, expanding it and putting my own slant on it, coming from the Outer Hebrides rather than the mainland or Orkney or Shetland. It's mainly the Celtic poets more than anybody else. There's little threads throughout the book. So part of the threads, there's certain love letters to my wife after 10 years, which are maybe more complicated than love letters. But there's also a series of sonnets inspired by the islands that I grew up around. And as any project, it starts as one thing and it evolves into something else, or it evolves hopefully. And this thought came, I was reading about the island of Delos, and I couldn't help but wanting to write a poem about it. On Delos, it was Apollo's island, and it was not allowed, you weren't allowed to die on Delos, and you weren't allowed to be born on Delos. So I just had that image as kind of, I've grown older and the people I care about have grown older. of what that might mean. My mum was caring for her brother who was dying at the time. So this is Island Sonnets Delos. I see the island's inadvertent grace. Delos, Apollo's home of the pale shore and black geese, the sacred Mediterranean, where none were allowed to die or to be born. My mother nurses her own brother through his end, moving from kitchen to his room with those hot cloths, their white folds in her hand. Dying seems this constant needing to be cleaned. Long nights of cotton brushing skin. I see what they were saved, when birth was just a wrapped child handled onto land, and death's coffin walk was a still living led to the shore's end. All the hands waving to them back and forth, the same movement of my mother as she tends.
As a recently appointed editor of the esteemed magazine Poetry London, I was wondering if you have a specific editorial focus in terms of themes or types of poetry you love to publish.
Not themes, no. I mean, I was asked this recently, would I consider a themed issue to focus on one topic? And I would never. I've got no interest in that. I love the idea of each issue being a sort of grab bag of things that have just moved me. You know, there's a sense of, I think some editors look at it as aesthetic pluralism. You know, the idea that everything can be great and your job is to reflect the variedness of what might be good. I'm a little bit against this idea. I think if you're only going to be in post for however many years, it might be 2 years or 3 years, you do need to make a stand and to say this I believe to be particularly great, or this I believe to not being reflected very well in what is being published in magazines or competitions or anything else at the moment. So what I'm just looking for is, I hope, sensitive writing, quiet writing. I think quiet writing, particularly shorter verse, shorter lyrics, is not very well represented in UK writing at the moment. We like big statements, we like quite loud things. Partly it's a time issue. People have less and less time, and so they want more of a hit when it comes to this. But I think there is still a space, and you can forge a space for intense, moving, poignant writing. And that's what I want Poetry London to be the home of, and to people to trust the magazine that will have a good audience and it'll be well showcased and celebrated. So that's a big part of it.
Great. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.